Welcome everybody. Chapter 34 is called The Thoughts of Jesus. Just as the Gospels give us for the most part only a series of scenes from the ministry of Jesus, rather than a systematic record of what he did, so they give us no exhaustive transcript of what he said. One of the writers of the Gospels, overwhelmed by the story he has to tell, closes his narrative with the comment that if the whole tale were told, the world itself might not be big enough to hold all the books which would have to be written. We can understand what he meant. Even allowing for the gospel writer's sense of his own inadequacy to deal with so vast a subject, it's clear that all the teaching that Jesus gave, that all the teaching of Jesus that we're given in the Gospels cannot be more than a fraction of what he said throughout his mission. But like the short anecdotes which cover the whole range of his activities, the selection of the sayings of Jesus which the Gospels provide is enough to give us a clear picture of the essence of his message. His main theme, as we have seen, was that a new age had begun. God was no longer to be regarded as a remote and rather terrifying being beyond the skies who demanded compliance with the law he had given to Moses, as the orthodox teaching of the time insisted, but as a living presence in men's lives, understanding and forgiving their failures and offering them the power of new life, showing them indeed how splendid ordinary life could be. When Jesus was talking to the crowds who gathered round him, his favourite method of instruction seems to have been that of telling them little stories, or parables as they were called. These were homely illustrations taken from daily life, suggesting in a way that anyone could understand the point that he wanted to make. There are many of these parables recorded in the Gospels, but we may take two of them as bringing out in a vivid way the theme of Jesus' message. They are, as it happens, perhaps the two best known of all, the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. Indeed, they're so well known that we may well miss the point. In the story of the prodigal son, the spotlight is not meant to fall on the boy who goes off in search of a good time, ends up destitute, and when he comes to his senses, returns home sadder and wiser. Nor on his elder brother, who takes a dim view of the fuss that is made over his homecoming, but on the boy's father. The old man is so delighted to get his son back again that he runs out to meet him, with words of welcome and not of reproach. Jesus' point is that this very human story suggests something of the love of God for even the most undeserving black sheep of his family. Samaritans were traditionally detested by Orthodox Jews. Yet in the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus underlines that it was one of these despised people, and not the pious Jew who passed by on the other side of the road, who helped the injured traveller lying in the ditch. The Samaritan had least reason of all to come to the rescue of the wounded Jew. But he was the one who understood best that human need comes before questions of race or creed. These two stories illuminate the two commandments that Jesus picked out of the great burdensome mass of obligations contained in the law, which the Pharisees wanted to hang round the neck of every citizen. Jesus maintained that the law could be summed up in the two commandments. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And you must love your neighbour as yourself. In loving God, we are to think of someone who is like the father in the story of the prodigal son. And in loving our neighbour, which doesn't necessarily mean liking our neighbour, we are to follow the example of the Good Samaritan, who understood that by neighbour was meant anyone at all who needed help. Most of Jesus' teaching, as it appears in the Gospels, was, however, not directed to the crowds, but to his disciples, to men who had committed their lives to God and who wanted to learn more of what was involved. If we keep this fact in mind, it will save us from the foolish mistake that many people make, who simply dismiss Jesus' teaching as quite impractical and unrealistic. We must not take sayings like turn the other cheek, resist not evil, take no thought for tomorrow, and love your enemies out of their context. Jesus is not addressing governments charged with the task of keeping law and order and protecting their citizens, and he's certainly not advocating peace at any price or national irresponsibility. When Jesus says, turn the other cheek and resist not evil, he's not telling us what we should do when faced with a maniac brandishing a crowbar. The Christian answer to that might be to look around for a bigger crowbar, or preferably to have learned judo or karate. No, Jesus is talking about our attitude to someone who has done us personal wrong, and is challenging our instinctive reaction to give as good as we get. His point is that we should rather make every effort to effect reconciliation, even if it involves swallowing our pride. Take no thought for the morrow certainly does not mean make no plans for the future, but rather don't worry about your future. And love your enemies doesn't mean like your enemies, but rather try to see the other man's point of view. In what we call the Sermon on the Mount, which is really a collection of the best remembered and therefore probably most often repeated sayings of Jesus, we're not given any programme of action which can be put into effect by any political party. Indeed, it can hardly be called a programme of action at all, even for individuals. Jesus is not outlining a blueprint for utopia or a code of social reform. No one apart from Jesus has ever loved God with all his heart and mind and soul and strength, to say nothing of loving his neighbour as much as he loves himself. But Jesus presented his followers with the challenge to try to do so. His whole emphasis is not on rules of behaviour with which we must comply, but on the general attitude to life that we must adopt if we want to live in the right relationship to God and to one another. In a sense, the Sermon on the Mount, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is painting a picture of himself. He never calls it that, of course, but as we look back over his life and compare it with the lives of the most saintly men and women of whom we have records in any religion, it's clear that no one apart from Jesus has ever measured up to the selfless concern for others and the total commitment to God which he demanded of his followers. In his teachings, Jesus is concerned to show what happens in a person's life when he gives himself to God and becomes a follower of Christ. And he claims that it is this kind of man who knows what true happiness is. Most of us, if we were asked, would say that a man is happy when he has a good health, a tidy bank balance, a worthwhile job, and a comfortable home. Jesus does not mention any of these, but says in what we call the Beatitudes that a man is happy when he lives his life in dependence of God, when he knows what sorrow means, when he's passionately concerned about justice, when he's merciful, utterly sincere, and bent on promoting the well-being of the community at all levels. It has been fashionable for some time to contrast Jesus' attitude to life with that of the Old Testament. Jesus, we've been told, stressed the positive approach, what we should do, rather than what we should not do. To some extent, this is true. The overall impression we get from the law of Moses is a list of the things that we must avoid doing. The Ten Commandments emphasise thou shalt not. We should be quite wrong, however, if we thought that Jesus substituted for the Ten Commandments some vague instruction to love God and our neighbour, and then left it to us to decide how that works out in practice. It's true that Jesus didn't prescribe a code of daily conduct to which we should conform. That was exactly what he criticised the Pharisees for doing. He saw only too well the danger that lay in that kind of attitude to life, of taking credit for being more pious and more virtuous than the man next door. As he put it trenchantly, when you have done everything you are told to do, you can say we have done no more than our duty. But he did specify certain things as being wrong at any time and in any circumstance. evil thoughts, lust, theft, murder, adultery, greed and malice, fraud, indecency, envy, slander, arrogance and folly. He approved of the 10 Commandments as a working rule, but he insisted that any man who was wholly committed to the service of God should not be satisfied with himself if he'd merely avoided breaking them. The sin of murder is not simply a matter of ending another man's life. It's the hate that leads to murder which is culpable. Similarly, it is not only the act of adultery in itself that constitutes the offence, but the intention which precedes it. In other words, what Jesus is concerned with is the inward disposition to commit a wrong against one's neighbour. This, of course, does not mean the temptation to do it, which is no crime if it is resisted. There are many other aspects of the teaching of Jesus on which it is impossible to linger. His condemnation of spurious religiosity, his insistence on our welcoming acceptance of God's good gifts of the material things in life, together with his warning against letting them become the be-all and end-all of our existence. His demand that we must be self-critical, his overriding concern for the underprivileged, and his constant stress of the sheer love of God. Perhaps we come closest to the heart of Jesus' thinking in the words of the Lord's Prayer. Familiarity and frequent repetition can blunt the cutting edge of these apparently simple sentences, which in a masterly way point us to the truth about God and ourselves as Jesus saw it. He begins by inviting us to speak and think of God as our Father. And we know from elsewhere in the Gospels that the word he used and encouraged his followers to use was Abba. This was the affectionate name that a Jewish child normally used in the family circle when he addressed his father. What Jesus is suggesting is that in approaching God, we're not to think of him primarily as the sovereign creator of the universe and the Lord of all men and nations. He is, of course, that. But he's also, more than any other human father, one who loves each of his children and who is always ready to understand our difficulties and to forgive our follies. It is this kind of God who holds the reins, and we're told to pray that his will may be done. And what we are told to pray for, we're meant to work for. It's a summons to each of us in his own home or shop or factory or office or in the wider sphere of public life to put service before self, to give of his or her best and to make his tiny corner of the human stage a better place for his having been there. This is God's world. But just because he is the loving Father of us all, he lets us make our own mistakes, for only in this way can we truly learn. When we can say to God, "Our wills are ours to make them thine," we've seen the point of thy will be done. It's not always easy to know what is the will of God when we're faced with a particular decision. We have sometimes simply to take our courage in both hands and do what we think is best. But much more often, we know only too well what is the will of God. Our real difficulty is to do it. Jesus knew all about this when he said that it is a narrow gate and a hard road that leads to the kind of life that God would have us live. But he also implied in the Lord's Prayer that God will give us the guidance and the strength that we need if we ask him. So he urges us to make the minimum demand for ourselves. Give us our daily bread. We're not encouraged to badger God with self-seeking pleas for our private ambitions, prestige, promotion, affluence, or such like. These may come our way or they may not. Jesus teaches us to ask for no more for ourselves than that we should be kept fit to do our job. As part of his realistic view of life, Jesus knew that however hard we try to live up to his standards and follow his example, we constantly fail. So in his pattern prayer, he teaches that we must constantly ask God's forgiveness for the things that we've done that we ought not to have done, and for all the things we have left undone. When we are told to ask God daily to forgive us our sins, it means that a basic element in the Christian life as Jesus understands it is a recognition that everything we do is tainted with self-interest. We never are the kind of men and women that we ought to be, or might be, or could have been. And beyond our personal failure, there is our implication through indifference or prejudice or stupidity in the collective guilt of humankind in all its blood-stained story. So, in the final petition of the Lord's Prayer, we're urged by Jesus to ask for God's help to avoid temptation and to be delivered from the power of evil. Jesus had no doubt that there is a mighty force of evil at work in the world, which militates against every attempt of men of goodwill to bring about a better state of society. Modern psychology would not call it Satan, as the Bible does, but it comes to the same thing. We are all, as Jesus knew, up against something irrational and demonic, however we explain it, something that affects us all and which we cannot overcome by our own efforts. Only by enlisting the stronger power of God can it be defeated. And it was the conviction of Jesus that the ultimate victory lies beyond this present world as we know it. Meantime, in the thought of Jesus, we must battle on, stumbling, falling, picking ourselves up and fighting again in the knowledge that if we commit our lives to God, we are on the winning side. His own life of apparent failure, of repeated disappointment, of suffering and of ultimate rejection is, as we shall see, the paradox that points to the truth about life and the key to the understanding of the mystery of our human existence. If we ask whether his teaching is so far above our heads as to be quite beyond our reach, we may single out one of his great sayings as being none too easy to practice, but nevertheless superbly reasonable and eminently worth trying. Treat other people exactly as you would like to be treated by them. This is the essence of all true religion.